Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you both to the Blacksburg Museum and to the folks at Smithfield Plantation for inviting me. As I'll show you in a minute, I think Blacksburg is the center of the universe, the entire universe, and we'll talk about that. I got involved after I retired. I had a long interest in history, but after I retired, I got first involved in Saltville, Virginia, and that led me to a broader interest to the history of Southwest Virginia. And I'll share with you a deep prejudice which I have, and that is that if you go to Richmond or to Tidewater, those guys down there have zero appreciation for what is undoubtedly the most historic part of the state of Virginia. So that sort of is my mindset, and that will come through a number of times this evening. Next one, Terry. This is the Smithfield Review. I don't get royalties for this, so please don't just buy one. Christmas is coming up, so buy several of these and give them away at Christmas. So my remarks are based on this article, and of course what always happens in these presentations, there are far more points that I need to make than I can make, so I'm just kind of float along the surface and leave this to your quiet reading when you can see the story in a more comprehensive and well laid out form. Next one, Terry. So here we are, and you know it's not quite in the middle of the world, but Smithfield is more or less in the middle of the world. A lot of our events begin, of course, in Williamsburg, which is the colonial capital at the time of the events I'm going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Fort Chiswell, which is a place which is very closely associated with the Fincastle Resolutions. And we're going to talk about a place that nobody's, I suspect, ever heard of, Fort Gower, which I claim is one of the great shrines of Virginia history. So I'll tell you about Fort Gower, and if I live long enough, we're actually going to get Fort Gower in the Roanoke Times. And way out here, in the center of Ohio, not far from the Indian town of Chillicothe, Camp Charlotte. Again, a place that you've probably never heard about, but I will argue that these places are not only important for our history locally, I will argue tonight that these places are important for Virginia history and even for Revolutionary American history. It's an interesting story. Next one. Oh, that's interesting. Why don't I have a map there? Thank you. Okay. Somebody, I want to tell you that we have had a big theft. Somebody stole Fincastle County. First of all, we're not talking about that little town up the road. We're not talking about Fincastle, Virginia, which happens to be in Botetourt County. We're talking about the entire county of Fincastle, which you can see only existed for 4 years, but when it did exist, it covered the entire future state of Kentucky, the southern half of the future West Virginia, and all of Western Virginia. That's Fincastle County. It only existed for those 4 years. It was divided out from a much larger Botetourt County and then broken up into the places I list there. Next one. It took me a while to figure out where this word Fincastle comes from. It wasn't an easy thing to do. It turns out, now if you look at that picture and you don't know where it is, that could be around here, couldn't it? But it turns out this is in the middle of Scotland. This is in Perthshire, in the county of Perth in central Scotland. And it turns out that the governor, John Murray, was the 4th Lord Dunmore. We're going to talk about the governor of Virginia, the last colonial governor of Virginia. And one of his many titles, I need a course in English peerage, but one of his titles was Viscount Fincastle. He was only the 4th Earl. The family had only been promoted to the peerage about the time of the Glorious Revolution at the end of the 17th century in England. And because he became an early governor of Virginia, he was governor in that last colonial period, there are many parts of Virginia which are named after his various titles. Next one. What are resolutions? We've talked about what Fincastle is. Now what are resolutions? Resolutions are also called resolves, and they were political statements. They were statements of political philosophy, of political discontent in many cases, collective statements of sentiment made by the freeholders. We're talking about a very limited electorate at this period of time. We're talking about men only voting, and we're talking about men who have property being the only people who can vote. These are the freeholders. And every county, not every, 60 out of 65 counties, adopted resolutions during the period of 1774 to 1775. And we know about them because one of the actions that the counties did after they'd met, the freeholders had met and held their meetings and made their resolves, was that they sent their resolves to Williamsburg. There were actually several Virginia Gazettes. It's one of the complications of Virginia history. There were several publications called the Virginia Gazette being published in Williamsburg, and they were printed. Next one, Terry. So this is, in fact, our original copy of the Fincastle Resolutions. I took this from the Colonial Williamsburg website. All of the known copies of the Virginia Gazettes are available, so you can go online to the website, the references in the article, and you can actually look at this firsthand. This is about the first couple of paragraphs of the Fincastle Resolutions. And you can already, even up here, see names of people that you may know. There's William Preston, William Christian, Stephen Trigg, Arthur Campbell, William Campbell, the hero of King's Mountain later on, James McGavock, all famous names in Southwest Virginia history. These were all people who, quote, signed the Fincastle Resolutions. Now, in fact, we don't have a handwritten copy. There is no extant handwritten copy. So we can't really say these people were the signers in the same sense as the Declaration of Independence, where we all know that John Hancock signed that document. But it's conventional. We speak of these folks as the signers. We assume that they signed, although there's actually no historical evidence that they did. In obedience to the resolves of the Continental Congress, that's the first Continental Congress, which had met in September and October of 1774 in Philadelphia. And you know the names of some of the people who were there: Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry and Edwin Pendleton. Those were the Virginia delegates, and you know people like John Adams and others from Massachusetts. That was the first North American association. Next one. Here's what they said in a few paragraphs. Now you've got it, and the quiz later on will be to see if you've actually studied this, but I'll just point a few highlights from the documents in your hand. We apologize, we're slow in responding to you gentlemen from Philadelphia, because we have been out chastising savages in the wilderness. You saw where they were all the way out into central Ohio, and that's wilderness in 1774. They're a long way west in 74. We will strictly adhere to your resolutions. What they're saying is, you gentlemen in Philadelphia, you're the Continental Association, and if you say it, then by gosh, we're going to do it out here in Fincastle County. Of course, our hearts overflow for that wonderful king. There's a great deal of prevarication in all of these documents, you know. People didn't exactly want redcoats at their door with muskets with bayonets on them. So there were a lot of formal sentiments of loyalty to the king, although the sentiments were often very formal. We cannot think of submitting our liberty or property to the power of venal ministry. This is one way of getting around the king, was to blame it all on the ministers. Well, that quite works the same way today, but anyway, that's the basic story that was going on. And these are our real, and you see, unpolished sentiments. Now, of course, again, they're being a little disingenuous, because all of the guys who signed the Fincastle Resolutions were pretty literate, well-read individuals. And so they're being a little disingenuous, claiming that they're unpolished. They're, in fact, quite polished. Next one. So, if there is a theme of tonight's talk, there are two themes, the official theme, and then I'll repeat the unofficial theme. The official theme is that we're still 6 months before the actual first shots at Lexington and Concord. There is no revolution. But this is a very famous letter, quoted by lots and lots of historians, from John Adams writing to Thomas Jefferson when they're both very old men. And Adams says, you know, the revolution really happened in people's minds, and when we actually got around to fighting it, it was all a foregone conclusion. After those first bullets at Lexington, the decisions were made. People had already decided that they were going to fight at that point. And the Fincastle Resolutions are a perfectly good example of that happening. Now, the unofficial statement is, you guys in Williamsburg, you notice that this happens out here. So the secondary theme of this article is Western Virginia is very important in the revolution, and I'll make that point repeatedly as we go through. Next one. Just a quick, the point about this transparency, or this slide, is to give you just a little bit of the context. People write books. There are hundreds of books if you want to try and understand why does the American Revolution happen. But just to give you a couple of minutes of background, in 1763, the British signed the Treaty of Paris. The French have been pushed out of North America. The British power around the world is incredible, everywhere. It's almost the height of the British Empire. And the British, having forced this Treaty of Paris, don't want to get involved in too many American complications. And they simply say, fine, we're just going to draw an imaginary line all down the top of the Appalachian chain, and everything to the west of that is reserved to the Indians. And guess what, you Virginians who've been fighting for that land, you just stay right where you are and don't go over there. Now you can imagine what the reaction is of one or two Americans, all of whom hold great land interests in the West. I'll call some names of Virginians who already own land or land claims in the future Ohio and the future Kentucky. How about Thomas Jefferson? How about George Washington? How about William Preston locally? How about Patrick Henry? And the list goes on. And so in Virginia, it may be that taxation is an issue and no taxation without representation and non-importation of tea. But at least in Virginia, the issue of the king by proclamation cutting off the western lands is a huge factor. There are other issues that go on. The requirement that Bostonians must house British troops, the notorious Stamp Act, and so on. And there are a whole series of events, none of which you can say itself leads to revolution, but which over a period of years creates a climate, an increasingly inimical climate in America, in the colonies, and particularly Virginia and Massachusetts. It's a very strange nexus, and I'll make a point about that later on, between Virginia and Massachusetts, which does lead eventually to the revolutionary break. And as I say here in the last point, simple statements about why the revolution happens are just that, simple statements. It's different in different colonies, it's different at different times in different colonies, it's different for different classes, and so there's no kind of tidy reason for the American Revolution. It's a complex building series of events. Next one, Terry, thank you. Here on the tree on the right, I'll tell you where this comes from in a minute, but here on the tree on the right you see the modern day Tea Partiers. This is a representation of the famous Boston Tea Party, in which, in objection to tax being put on tea, Bostonians dressed up as Indians and threw a large quantity of tea into Boston Harbor. What I like about this is that you see in the top line, where does this image come from? It's on the flood wall at Point Pleasant, West Virginia. Point Pleasant is going to be very important in our story later on. It's where the Kanawha River, which is the name those West Virginians give our new river, it's the point where the Kanawha River flows into the Ohio. That's called Point Pleasant. And it's there that all of our guys from Fincastle got themselves involved in a huge battle. I'll show you about that later on. And just recently, within the last couple of years, there's a fellow called Dafford, you see his name there, who's a famous muralist, and he's been hired, and they're going for 400 or 500 yards. Just a wonderful set. So if you perchance to get anywhere near Point Pleasant, West Virginia, which is just right across the river from Ohio, this is worth seeing. Next one, Terry. The British pass an act, an infamous act. We're going to close down the port of Boston. You Bostonians can't act like that. We're the British Parliament. We're just going to shut down your port. Fill Boston with redcoats, all of whom will have to live in your houses. Well, the Virginians, led by Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee, who's rapidly becoming one of my favorite rebels, simply say, well, they passed resolutions in the House of Burgesses, we're going to have a day of fasting and prayer in support of our Boston friends. Lord Dunmore said, end of that, with the royal prerogative that Charles I used to have, got Charles I into trouble too. Dunmore simply shuts down the House of Burgesses. So all the Burgesses meet, guess where? Bars are very prominent in our story, hostelries and taverns, and they meet in the Raleigh Tavern, picture of the outside and an older picture of the so-called Apollo Room on the inside, and they form an association. Not everybody, but most of the members of the House of Burgesses simply meet. That really is, if you want to put a moment when there's a huge political change in Virginia, it's that meeting. Because this is a meeting of the members of the House of Burgesses with no authority other than their own. They simply say, We're an association, and we're going to start issuing orders. And what they do is they call for a convention. And down the bottom here, I quote some of what they said. And amazingly, only one copy of this has survived. It was found in George Washington's papers, so it was remarkable that we even got this to survive. We fix this distant date. They've called for a Virginia convention on August the 1st. We fix this distant date in the hopes of accommodating the meeting to every gentleman's private affairs. And in the meantime, the gentlemen might have the opportunity of collecting the sense of their respective counties. Those are the resolutions. What they're saying is, go back, you members of the House of Delegates, you go back to Botetourt and Fincastle and Lancaster and all the other Virginia counties, and you have a meeting of the freeholders, and you write some resolutions. This is really the first beginning of overt political independence in Virginia. Next one. So what happens is, paragraph 1, between June the 1st, which is just after the gentlemen got back to their counties, and the 4th of August, 40 out of 65 counties write resolutions. We've lost one or two, but we have almost all of them. Now, some of them are really remarkable. Somebody once wrote that the Fincastle Resolutions pre-shadow the Declaration of Independence. If you go and read the Fairfax Resolve, 7 pages, which was written this summer, I think in June or July, boy, that's a fighting document. That's 7 pages of really tough stuff. We've got George Mason and George Washington and all of those guys who've been involved in the House of Burgesses. And many of these documents, it's hard to summarize 40 documents in a paragraph, but in paragraph 2 you can see the kinds of things that many of these documents said. Venal ministers, we support the guys in Boston, arbitrary rights exercised in America, we're British Americans and our fundamental rights have been taken away by Parliament. This comes again and again and again and again. And all of these documents, or at least most of these documents, are extended. I mentioned already that the Fairfax Resolves were notable. Now, I don't understand what's going on with Lord Dunmore, and I've read a lot about Lord Dunmore, and I've read a lot of historians. At this most critical time in Virginia history, when Virginia is basically becoming independent, Dunmore takes off for 5 months and marches to Ohio to fight Indians. Now, it's just my opinion, but after reading and thinking about it a lot, I think he was just fed up with all these rebels in Williamsburg, and it was a relief to get out of town and spend some time under the stars and in a tent. That's just Jim Glanville's opinion. But anyway, he's gone at this critical time, and he marches all the way to Ohio, and he doesn't come back until December. That gives Virginia a chance to develop, through these county associations, its own government. And you know, it's remarkable. Somebody once said about Oliver Cromwell that the thing about the Cromwellian Revolution was it changed so little. What Oliver Cromwell wanted to do was to keep England just the way it was, but get rid of the king. And in a way, in Virginia, the American Revolution parallels that, because all the guys who are running the counties in Virginia before this happened are all the same guys who are in charge and running the counties after it all happens. In a way, it's this kind of strange transition. All we lose is the king, and everything else, the common law, the cooperation of the court system, and so on, all stays the same. Next one, Terry. The big event of Dunmore's war, Dunmore gathers up all of these forces, our guys too, 2,000 men. One wing marches up, goes up through modern-day Pittsburgh and down the river. Dunmore's on that wing. And then our guys, Christian and Russell and Shelby and Edmondson and McGavock and all of our guys, we had to march across southern West Virginia. That's not such a good route. And we're supposed to all converge up on the Ohio River. But before we get converged, our guys get jumped by the Indians. So it's only half the army that gets involved in the fighting. And this is the Dafford Muriel at Point Pleasant. Next one, Terry. Here's Point Pleasant today. And I had the good fortune. I went and spent some time there last October. And it's really nice. Here you can see this is the bridge over the Kanawha. And I don't know why in America we celebrate everything with Egyptian obelisks, but anyway, here's our Egyptian obelisk. This one celebrates the biggest Indian fight ever. It's a kind of a strange place. Here you can see this is the flood war, so the river is behind me. And I don't know what we've got these stainless steel statues of Chief Cornstalk on the left and Andrew Lewis on the right. But anyway, they're kind of there, and I sort of spent some time thinking about those and figuring out what they were. And on this big monument to the right, next one, Terry, this is it. So this big plaque is on that big monument, okay? Now I'm not going to go into this in detail, but here you can see, here are the Botetourt regiments, and here are the Fincastle regiment, and there are 6 or 7 of these guys who are going to sign later on, who are going to sign the Fincastle Resolutions, and the Botetourt Resolutions, and the Pennsylvania Resolutions, so that these guys are out there fighting this battle. They win. It's not a very pretty event. The Indians give them a tough fight, and the battle lasts all day, and you know, it's kind of like the Battle of Hastings where allegedly, I'm never quite sure about battle histories, but in any event, allegedly Andrew Lewis fakes a retreat, and that fakes the Indians out, and in any event, they win the battle, and they march north to join up with Dunmore's wing, who's been untouched. Next one, Terry. So here's what happened after the Battle of Point Pleasant. The army, the 2 wings of the army join up, and Dunmore simply goes off into Ohio to chastise the Indians. Signs treaties, forces a treaty on the Indians, and he returns to Fort Gower. That's his kind of base. Fort Gower, I'll show you pictures of Fort Gower in a minute, is about 12 miles downriver from Parkersburg, West Virginia. And you wouldn't think that anything ever happened of consequence in Fort Gower ever happened. And if you go there today, you can find very little evidence of it. The army then disperses after the officers make resolutions. Next one. Just as a couple of incidentals, here we are out in central Ohio. This is Camp Charlotte. You can't see any of this today. All that's there is this little plaque. And look at it. That's where it is. There's it. Way out there in the middle of Ohio. I mean, it took me about 20 minutes of driving around to find it. This is where the Camp Charlotte Treaty is signed, and this again is one of those wonderful dappled murals. I doubt that that Lord Dunmore and the officers looked that good on the actual day. I doubt that they were dressed up in fancy red uniforms. But anyway, there's a little artistic license and out there. Next one. And so they go back to Camp Charlotte, and I want to read you this because this is such a great line, okay? And it's from Robert Scribner, who was the general editor of the 7-volume series on Virginia, on the Virginia Revolution. By that peace, this is the peace out at Camp Charlotte. By that peace, which was to last 3 years, Dunmore freed for employment elsewhere the rifles that helped tatter the Anglo-German army at Saratoga, and coupled with Washington's audacious attack at Germantown, brought France to play a decisive role in the war, and by temporarily stopping Indian incursions into Kentucky, he opened the lands there for a flood of white settlements that formed the base of British operations and control of the Old Northwest. Now let's think about what he's saying there, okay? This is what Scribner says. He says, Dunmore's war, right, frees up the Virginia riflemen to win the Revolution. I'm not stretching that point too much, right? He frees up the riflemen to win the Revolution. That's the first point he makes. And the second point he makes is, he says that preserves Kentucky and opens up the entire West for the Americans. He goes on to say, and I did it on this slide, he says, if there was ever a shrine in Washington for American heroes who weren't American, Lord Dunmore should have his picture on the wall in Congress for being the greatest American hero, because what he did in Ohio actually made the Revolution winnable. Next one. You can't find Fort Gower. Okay. It turns out, I'm driving around. Here it is. It's a pretty, you can tell the kind of day. This is the Ohio River. West Virginia's to the right and Ohio's to the left. We're at the mouth of the Hockhocking River, okay? And this is an interesting area. It's kind of like some parts of the New River or the Greenbrier in southern West Virginia. This is kind of like caravan camping summer homeland. You know, it's kind of recreational land. And I'm driving around and I'm stopping people. Where's Fort Gower? Oh, you know. Nobody has a... So finally I'm nosing around and I see this sign. And this sign says, Fort Gower resurrected 2008. And this is Lance Rep. Okay? And he built a kind of a garage building behind his house, and he put this sign which says, this is Fort Gower. And so I finally go bang on his door. Where's Fort Gower? Well, it's somewhere around here, you know. And it turns out he has a big scrapbook which he loaned to me, which I brought back to Blacksburg and photocopied. And when I finished the article, I sent him a copy of the article in the mail. I got an email about a week ago from Lance, and he said, that's really good. I'm pleased I liked your article. And I promise you, if you ever actually find any archaeological evidence for Fort Gower, you're going to be the first person to know about it. So if we ever find Fort Gower, stay tuned. I finally found it. There's one bronze plaque put up by the Daughters of the American Revolution in 1923. But it took me about 3 hours. And only, if I hadn't known Lance Rep, I don't think I'd have ever found the plaque. Next one. All right, before I go into this, let me tell you, I think that the Fort Gower is huge. The Fort Gower Resolves, which I'm not going to go into in detail, but which are in the article. The Fort Gower Resolves, I think, betray a very important change in the Virginia attitude, because the Fort Gower Resolves are written by officers who've just put down the Indians. They figured out that they're a pretty good fighting army, and they betray a sense of self-worth. I have said it shows that the Western Virginia men and the officers of Dunham's army actually had begun to believe that they could win a war with the English. I think the event is sufficiently seminal that it really represents a change. They say, in the Resolves, they say, we've marched with just bread and salt and slept under the stars, and we can fight with any men in the world. It's a very kind of self-confident document. And this was it was quickly published, and it was very quickly known to people like Richard Henry Lee in Eastern Virginia, because a couple of months later, Richard Henry Lee is writing to Arthur Lee in England, saying, you know, those guys out in Fincastle who can produce 1,000 men with rifles, who don't need any food, they can march and fight anywhere, they can take on the British Army. It's an important aspect of the Revolution. So, the Virginia Convention met. On the political front, Thomas Jefferson published a summary view of British rights of British Americans. That becomes an important document because Jefferson argues in that document that the king doesn't own Ohio. That just because the Englishmen settled Virginia, Western land doesn't belong to the English. That has a very profound effect on the argument. The First Continental Congress meets, and by the way, when the army got back to Fort Gower, we have it on the word of Daniel Morgan, when the army got back from Camp Charlotte, they were waiting for news. And they knew. News traveled much faster than I understood before I started this project. News traveled very fast. And they knew at Fort Gower that the Continental Congress had met and issued resolves and declarations. And that kind of puffed up their chests. And that was part of the reason that they wrote the Fort Gower Resolves. I told you about Dunmore's battle. I told you about the adoption. And on December 13th, Northampton County was the first jurisdiction to make resolutions in this second wave. We're going to have a whole second wave. But the officers out in Ohio had already made theirs. They'd already made their resolutions. Now, the second wave of resolutions, in which Fincastle is a part, are different. They're no longer a Virginia event. They're now a national event. This is the first local response to the First Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia. So at that point, the momentum towards separation is really building. Next one. That's the second wave. So 19 more counties acted between 13th of March, Northampton, as I told you, over on the Eastern Shore, and March of 1775. That brings the total up to something like 59 out of the 65 counties. The 4 western counties, boy, they're the tough ones. And in my mind, I've come to think now of Augusta and Botetourt and Pittsylvania and Fincastle really as a piece. Their sentiments are not identical, but their sentiments are very similar. And most of the people who are involved, certainly a significant minority of the people involved, were at Fort Gower and at Point Pleasant. So there is a certain commonality between them because many of the men have had the same experience. The Fincastle Resolution, I have to tell you, this is the bad news, okay? For those who think they're so important, we're actually the 46th set of resolutions, 46 out of 59. So we're not chronologically very prominent. Next one. Here's what they were. Say a little bit more about the Fincastle Resolutions. They were addressed to the people, from the freeholders of Fincastle, the Virginia delegates. They were promulgated on 20th of January 1770 near Fort Chiswell. Oh. Now you have to read the article to get the detailed arguments. You know that the whole history of Virginia says that they were signed at the lead mines. The lead mines are way down there, 10 miles off of Interstate 81, 10 miles off of the Great Road. The courthouse was put at the lead mines. Would political influence ever be a factor? William Byrd III, one of the Virginia oligarchs, owned the lead mines. So wouldn't it be nice if you just happened to build this new county courthouse, this wonderful new Fincastle County? Why don't you put the courthouse right on my property? Wouldn't that be very nice? William Preston wasn't having any of that. He started writing angry letters. I've quoted some of the letters in the article. William Preston saying, this is a stupid place to put a courthouse. And sure it was. It's almost clear. I don't quite have a smoking gun, but I can prove that 2 weeks after the Fincastle Resolutions were signed, there was a call for another meeting of the freeholders. 2 weeks later, in writing, guess where 2 weeks later the freeholders met? You only get one guess. They met in Fort Chiswell. It doesn't seem very likely they would have met 2 weeks. I can't prove it, but I think the evidence is pretty clear. Next one. What these things were not, okay? This is just one kind of a cheap shot transparency. The Magna Carta of the wilderness. Now, I mean, that's a little bit, it's a little bit overcooked, isn't it? Hey, I want to argue it wasn't wilderness. I mean, it wasn't that much wilderness. It certainly wasn't a Magna Carta. The first Declaration of Independence. This is Thomas W. Preston. Thomas W. Preston out of Bristol. This is an article from 1967 from the Wythe County paper. Wythe County, Virginia, birthplace of independence. Well, next one. All right, so here in summary, here are these resolutions. Here's Fincastle in blue, Botetourt in purple, Augusta up in red, and Pennsylvania is kind of in yellow down there. And if you look way up here, you can see there's Fort Gower. And these 5 sets of resolves and resolutions really need to be taken as a piece, because many of the same men are writing all of these. They are in response to the First Continental Congress, and they are saying basically, we are going to really take a chance. If the king really wants to push his luck, guess what? We've got the rifles, and guess what? We're willing to have a crack at it. And I think that that's already happened by this point of time. It's going to take 4 or 5 months, and the revolution is not going to start in Virginia. The hot revolution is going to start at Lexington and Concord, and the famous story that we know about in Massachusetts. But Virginia is primed for this. Virginia is absolutely primed for this. And these guys out on the northern neck and in Williamsburg are already relying on the long rifles of the men from these western counties. Next one. All right, so here's a little bit more about Fort Chiswell. You can't see this too well. This is a Google map, but I'll tell you what's going on here. This is Interstate 81, and many have probably been there at the Fort Chiswell exit. And that was, when they built that exit back in 75 or 76, that was hugely torn up. And any real archaeological evidence for Fort Chiswell was destroyed at that point. I mean, they raised the land 35 foot to make the ramps and so on. So we're not going to have any real archaeological shot. That's where I'm standing at that X, and you can, there's both a ramp and then there's kind of a parallel side road, and you can actually drive up that road. And that's where I'm standing. The interstate is just behind. This is Mary Kegley, who took me on a trip. We went to spend a whole afternoon looking at sites in Southwest Virginia. And she's right at the red X, and I'm looking north towards Mary. Actually, I'm looking south towards Mary at the lower picture, and then that's the view you see. So I think that the Fincastle Resolution is actually somewhere around where those horses are. But the chances of actually, that's where McGavick's Tavern was, approximately. But we're not going to have any real archaeological evidence for that. This, of course, is where the lead mines are. That's about 9 miles to the south, where there is this magnificent granite monument with brass plates. Okay. And of course, it's in the wrong place. But That's Virginia history, isn't it? My favorite Virginia writer about history is James Branch Cabell. Once wrote about a brass plate in Northern Virginia and said, this plate is perfect. It's absolutely wonderful. It's perfect Virginia history. It's all wrong, but of course what it does record is not what in fact did happen, but what ought to have happened. And that's all. Next, so this is where it records. Okay, next, thanks. All right, this is just a little map I put in the article to show you these are all our guys. So these are the folks who signed them, and they lived all up and down the modern I-81 corridor. Actually, I'd like to know about one or two more of these people. We know a lot about Christian and Trigg and Preston, obviously, we know a great deal about. We know a fair amount about Reverend Charles Cummings. Madison was a bit of a mystery, who was also married to Patrick Henry. Next one. Oh, and this I love. The thing that makes of all the Virginia resolutions absolutely unique, okay? The Fincastle Resolutions are the only ones that have been philatelically immortalized. And it turns out that William Christian came from the Isle of Man. And they issued this stamp. This is a 1976 Isle of Man stamp. Now, the Isle of Man, for those of you who don't know it, there's no reason you should, is a thing about 8 miles long, halfway between Ireland and England, in the middle of the Irish Sea. And it's got its own kind of constitution. I think it has its own government. Anyways, it's kind of an interesting, and it has its own stamps. And they issued this, okay, about Fletcher Christian. Now, they were very relieved when I wrote to them. I said, I want permission. They were very relieved that I was going to write about William Christian and not about Fletcher Christian, because Fletcher Christian was the chief mutineer on the Bounty. So they were very grateful that I was going to write anything about Fletcher Christian. They were very happy to have me writing about William Christian. And it's the only time in my life exchanging emails. You know when you get emails, how at the bottom it always says, if you have received this email in error, do not open it, do not read this email, destroy this email immediately, throw it in the fire, and do not ever give it to anybody else. It said all of that, right? And then it said it all in Gaelic. It's the first time I've ever been addressed in Gaelic in my whole life. Now, there is a problem, which I have not been so, I don't mind picking on Virginia historians, but I'm not going to pick on Isle of Man historians. There's a problem with this stamp because Christian's obviously going the wrong way. Because he clearly should be going from left to right if he's going to Williamsburg with the Fincastle Resolutions. And he really did carry him. We have no idea whether he walked or how he got there. But it is true that he shows up in Williamsburg about 2 weeks after they've been sold. I'll tell you why in a second. And so I thought I should turn this around. I've got another famous transparency where I just rotated it. But I would turn the Isle of Man into the Nam of Elsie, and that doesn't... so you'd know I cheated if I did that. All right, next one. Patrick Henry. Lots of Patrick Henry connections. William Christian was the brother-in-law of Patrick Henry. He married Anne. And in fact, Christian went out in 1767 to study law with Patrick Henry. And a couple of years later, there's a letter from, to Israel Christian, who's William's father, from Patrick Henry's father, saying, Mr. Christian has been showing the paces to my daughter Anne. You know, and so that's what happens. And then it turns out that Patrick Henry's father-in-law, Shelton, grew on hard times and first sort of mortgaged land to Patrick Henry and then gave Patrick Henry land. And Patrick Henry actually owned a fair amount of land, both on the Clinch River and way down on the Holston. And Patrick Henry came through Virginia, Western Virginia in 1768, trying to find his parcels of land. That, again, is not a fact that's too well known. So there were lots and lots of connections between Williamsburg and Western Virginia. And who knows, I've said this before, I'm going to do my very, very best to prove that it was actually in Western Virginia we really did write the Declaration of Independence for Patrick Henry. But that's tongue-in-cheek. Don't take that seriously. Next one. All right. Principal conclusion. I'll let you ask me. Go ahead and we won't run the conclusions. And I think next one, Terry. Okay. So hopefully I've left plenty of time for questions. I didn't want to bore you. So it's question time. Thanks.